If you've ever wondered why your garden hits a ceiling, why tomatoes stay good but never phenomenal, why your corn barely reaches waist height, or why your soil seems to weaken year after year, the truth is simpler than you think. It's not your seeds. It's not your watering. And it's not even the fertilizer you're using. The real issue is the missing minerals, the ones that used to exist naturally in our soils before industrial agriculture drained them out in fertilizer. Companies decided it was more profitable to sell the same 3 ingredients over and over again. The crazy part is that in 20 years of testing walking homesteads, reviving dead soils, and helping average gardeners double their yields, these overlooked minerals have consistently delivered 2 to 3 times the harvest, richer flavor, stronger disease resistance, and soil that practically comes alive again. And today, I'm breaking down the 10 minerals fertilizer companies quietly buried, and how you can bring them back on any budget starting this season. This isn't some Pinterest-level list. This is the stuff I've personally tested in the field, side by side, season after season. Let's get into it. Before we jump into the minerals, you need to understand why they disappeared. Modern fertilizers revolve around 3 letters: NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. They grow plants, sure, but they don't grow soil. They don't restore structure, they don't fix micronutrient imbalances. They don't rebuild microbial populations, and they certainly don't make your land self-sustaining. Fertilizer companies know that if they gave you complete nutrition, you'd stop buying their products. If your soil could maintain fertility on its own, they'd lose a customer. So instead, they turned NPK into a religion and quietly erased everything else from the conversation. But real ecosystems, forests, prairies, untouched farmland, never relied on 3 nutrients. They had dozens. That's why wild foods still outperform commercial produce in flavor and nutrition. Fertilizer companies didn't just ignore the other minerals. They buried them. The first mineral on the list, the one I've seen create dramatic changes faster than almost anything else, is boron. If you've ever dealt with blossom end rot, poor fruit set, hollow stems, small flowers, or plants that stall out even when they're well fed, there's a strong chance your soil is starving for boron. Most gardeners don't realize this, but boron controls the reproductive functions in nearly every crop: flowering, fruiting, seed production, and even the movement of calcium through plant tissue. In my soil tests, 9 out of 10 backyards are deficient. Fertilizer companies steer clear of boron because it is incredibly potent. A little goes a long way, and if more gardeners used it, they'd quickly discover that many so-called fertilizer problems were actually boron problems. When boron is restored, fruit set skyrockets, stems strengthen, and calcium-related issues disappear. I ran a tomato test where everything was identical except for the boron. And the difference was insane: 3 times the flowers, double the fruit, sturdier stems, no blossom end rot, and sweeter flavor, all from a tiny dose. The key is applying it carefully. A teaspoon of borax or Silica dissolved in water once a season is enough. For fruit trees, a teaspoon or 2 around the drip line once a year works wonders. Boron pairs beautifully with calcium, so using them together amplifies results. The second mineral, zinc, controls something just as important: growth itself. When plants grow slowly, stay stunted, or feel like they're stuck in first gear, zinc is almost always the missing ingredient. Zinc regulates leaf expansion, root development, enzyme activity, chlorophyll production, and disease resistance. And here is the part fertilizer companies will never mention: zinc actually reduces the plant's need for nitrogen. Since nitrogen is the cash cow of the fertilizer industry, zinc is conveniently left out of the spotlight. Zinc deficiency shows up as tiny leaves, yellow striping between the veins, twisted foliage, and squash or corn that never seems to size up. I once ran a zucchini trial where the zinc-treated plants looked like they'd been supercharged massive leaves. Earlier fruiting, thicker roots, and the craziest part is they needed 35% less nitrogen. That's a direct threat to the fertilizer business model. Applying zinc is simple. You can use zinc sulfate, liquid zinc chelate, or remineralizers like azomite, and use a teaspoon or 2 in water early in the season. Then repeat for heavy feeders. Zinc works even better when paired with iron, which we'll get into in the next section. The third mineral on this list is one I recommend more than anything else when I'm called to look at dead soil. Soil that is compact, unresponsive, lifeless, or just refuses to grow anything beyond a weak leaf or 2. That mineral is calcium, but not in the way most gardeners think about it. Most people toss around terms like add lime or use eggshells. But real soil calcium isn't just about raising pH or tossing crushed shells into the dirt. Calcium is the mineral that determines whether nutrients move or stay locked up, whether roots expand or suffocate, and whether your soil structure becomes fluffy and oxygen-rich or hard and stagnant. It's the mineral that decides whether your plants actually use the nutrients you give them. And here is the part most fertilizer labels avoid mentioning. NPK fertilizers become dramatically more effective or dramatically more wasteful, depending on calcium levels. When calcium is missing, nitrogen burns off instead of being absorbed. Phosphorus gets stuck in the soil, and potassium becomes either excessive or useless. Fertilizer companies don't talk about this because it exposes how incomplete their products are. They're selling nutrients while ignoring the mineral that determines whether those nutrients even work. I've seen calcium revive soils that people thought were hopeless. I once worked on a homestead with soil so compact I could barely push a soil probe 6 inches deep. The plants looked exhausted, no matter how much compost they added. After a single season of applying gypsum, a form of calcium that doesn't raise pH, the difference was incredible. The soil loosened up, roots went deeper, water penetration improved, and suddenly the same beds were producing cucumbers and tomatoes like the soil had been given a second life. Calcium doesn't act fast, but when it takes hold, it transforms everything: soil texture, microbial activity, and nutrient availability. The real trick is using the right form powdered gypsum for tightening clay or lowering sodium, soft rock phosphate for long-term release, or even oyster shell flour for lighter soils. And if you really want to see magic, pair calcium with boron from part 1. Calcium is the builder. Boron is the delivery system. When they work together, fruits become firmer, plants stand straighter, and nutrient flow increases dramatically. The fourth mineral, iron, is one almost every gardener knows exists, but very few understand how important it really is. Iron deficiency is often mistaken for nitrogen deficiency because the symptoms look similar: pale leaves, weak growth, and a tired-looking plant. But iron controls something nitrogen can't touch: chlorophyll production itself. Without iron, plants simply can't turn sunlight into energy, no matter how much fertilizer you pour on them. And here's the kicker: many soils actually have iron, but it's locked up and unusable, especially in alkaline soils or beds with too much phosphorus from chemical fertilizers. Fertilizer companies don't want growers learning this because iron unlocks the plant's natural ability to photosynthesize more efficiently, which means you need far less fertilizer in the first place. I've restored iron levels in dozens of gardens using nothing more than a combination of chelated iron and a small amount of organic acid in the water. The change happens fast. Leaves turn from washed-out yellow back to deep green in a matter of days, not weeks. Plants look alive again, corn straightens up, squash begins expanding, and leafy greens regain their rich color. When you restore iron, you're restoring the plant's ability to feed itself, which is the most sustainable advantage a gardener can get. And here is a trick most people don't know. Iron works better when applied early in the morning or late in the evening when leaves are more receptive. And if you pair iron with zinc, remember zinc from part 1? Should amplify chlorophyll production dramatically. Zinc helps generate the enzymes plants need for growth, and iron gives them the ability to turn sunlight into energy to fuel that growth. Together, they create a level of vigor that chemical fertilizers can't fake. The fifth mineral on the list is one of my personal favorites because it consistently increases flavor, yield, and disease resistance across just about every crop you can think of. That mineral is manganese, the quiet powerhouse that almost nobody talks about. Manganese is responsible for activating enzymes inside the plant that regulate everything from root growth to carbohydrate production to disease response. If boron is the reproductive mineral and zinc is the growth accelerator, manganese is the plant's immune commander. It determines how strongly your plants respond to stress, drought, heat, fungal pressure, and even insect attacks. But manganese isn't just defensive, it plays a major role in sugar production. And if you've ever tasted a bland tomato or a cucumber that tasted like plain water, you know exactly what happens when manganese is missing. Years ago, I did a trial on a patch of determinate tomatoes, using manganese sulfate on half the bed. The difference wasn't just visible, it was edible. The treated plants produced tomatoes with higher Brix readings, richer color, and noticeably better texture. The untreated plants looked fine, but the flavor was flat. Manganese also tightens up growth patterns, helping plants grow with more structure and less floppiness. If you've ever had plants that look tall but weak, elongated but fragile, That's often a manganese issue, not a nitrogen one. Applying manganese is straightforward. A teaspoon or two of manganese sulfate dissolved in water is enough to correct most deficiencies. And if you're using homemade compost, pairing it with manganese can significantly increase its nutrient availability. The sixth mineral on this list is one that transforms soil faster than almost anything else you can add, and it's probably the most misunderstood of them all: magnesium. Most gardeners only think about magnesium when they hear the word Epsom salt, but magnesium's role goes way beyond greening up leaves or fixing yellowing in peppers. Magnesium is literally the central atom inside every chlorophyll molecule. Without magnesium, plants can't perform photosynthesis efficiently, which means they can't create energy from sunlight, no matter how rich your soil is. Magnesium determines whether plants grow slowly or vigorously, whether leaves turn deep green or stay pale, and whether fruits reach full size or stall halfway. Fertilizer companies emphasize magnesium because it highlights the limitations of NPK fertilizers. Even if you blast plants with nitrogen, they'll never achieve full potential without magnesium. I've seen magnesium change gardens almost overnight. Years ago, I worked with a grower who couldn't figure out why his peppers never grew past ankle height. He added compost, manure, fertilizer, nothing worked. The soil test showed magnesium was almost non-existent. We applied a balanced magnesium amendment kieserite instead of the typical Epsom salt because it also delivered sulfur, and within 2 weeks those same peppers went from sickly pale to rich glossy green. Once the plants could create energy again, their growth exploded. But here's the trick: magnesium needs to be balanced with calcium. Too much calcium suppresses magnesium, and too much magnesium tightens soil structure. That's why using dolomite lime indiscriminately is a big mistake. If you want lush, dark foliage and faster growth, magnesium is essential, but it has to be used thoughtfully, especially in clay-rich soils. The seventh mineral, sulfur, is perhaps the most underrated mineral in modern gardening, despite being absolutely essential for plant metabolism, enzyme function, and the formation of amino acids. Most people don't realize sulfur used to be abundant in the atmosphere thanks to older industrial emissions. Ironically, once air quality regulations cleaned up pollution, sulfur quietly disappeared from soils across entire regions. Fertilizer companies didn't rush to fix the gap because sulfur isn't profitable on its own. It's inexpensive, widely available, and it drastically improves nutrient uptake, which reduces the need for chemical fertilizers. Sulfur enhances nitrogen efficiency, strengthens stems, deepens flavor, and even helps control soil-borne diseases. In my experience, crops like onions, garlic, cabbage, broccoli, and legumes respond dramatically when sulfur is restored. One season, I conducted a trial using elemental sulfur on brassicas. I had been working with a gardener who struggled for years with weak cabbage heads and chronically bitter kale. By applying sulfur early in the season, we lowered the soil pH slightly and supplied the mineral directly to the plants. The results were remarkable: tighter cabbage heads, sweeter kale, greener leaves, and far fewer fungal issues. Sulfur also boosts flavor, especially in onions and garlic, because it's directly responsible for the aromatic compounds that make them taste the way they do. You can apply sulfur through elemental sulfur, gypsum, kieserite, or sulfate-based fertilizers. And here's an insider tip: sulfur pairs extremely well with calcium and magnesium, creating one of the most powerful nutrient trios you can use in a garden. The eighth mineral on this list is the one that builds strength into your plants, the mineral that determines whether stems stand tall against wind, whether fruits stay attached, whether leaves resist tearing, and whether plants produce strong, well-structured growth. That mineral is silica, or more specifically, soluble silicon. Most gardeners have no idea how important silica is because fertilizer companies almost never include it in their products. Silica doesn't boost yields directly, so it's not considered profitable, but what it does do is make plants tougher, more resilient, and more resistant to disease and environmental stress. In nature, silica is absorbed slowly through weathered volcanic rock and decomposed plant material. But modern soils, especially those that have been tilled, sprayed, or compacted, are often depleted. Silica strengthens cell walls, which means thicker stems, sturdier leaves, and fruiting branches that don't collapse under their own weight. I once worked with a greenhouse grower who struggled with tomato plants that kept snapping at the stem joints once fruit clusters formed. He tried trellising, pruning, and different fertilizers, but nothing worked. Once we introduced a soluble silica source, potassium silicate, the stems strengthened noticeably within a few weeks. The plants not only held themselves upright, but they also resisted powdery mildew far better than before. Silica also reduces water stress, helping plants bounce back from heat and drought. Gardeners who grow cucumbers or squash in hot regions will see especially big improvements. And here is something most people don't know. Silica makes pests less interested in your plants. When cell walls thicken, leaves become physically tougher and less attractive to insects that prefer soft, easy-to-chew tissue. What came next was the part of the story most people never hear, not because it's uninteresting, but because almost every institution with power had a reason to erase it. When rural communities realized they couldn't rely on unpredictable markets, failing harvests, or government support, they quietly built their own survival systems. These weren't random survival hacks or gardening tips. They were complete, interconnected blueprints for food independence. And here is the part fertilizer companies really hated. Most of these systems ran on plants and minerals you didn't have to buy, could reproduce themselves year after year, and actually improve soil instead of draining it. Instead of tilling the land into exhaustion like industrial farms, these old-world growers used a layered approach that looks almost too simple until you see how well it works. At the base were the forgotten minerals that fed the soil. On top of that were perennial crops, forever crops, that came back every year without replanting. Around them were companion plants that fixed nitrogen, repelled pests, or attracted pollinators. They created food ecosystems, not gardens. And because everything supported everything else, these plots didn't collapse the moment something went wrong: bad weather, pests, drought, it didn't matter. Once the system stabilized, it produced more food with less work than anything you could buy in a bag. This is the part corporations feared the most. Once a family built one of these systems, they stopped spending money. No more fertilizers. No more soil amendments. No more weekly trips to the garden center. A small group of homesteaders in the early 1900s even documented these methods in handwritten journals, calling them closed-loop gardens. Their goal wasn't profits, it was resilience. A garden should feed itself, one wrote. And if it cannot, it is not a garden, it is a debt. That single sentence explains why the system disappeared. Crop scientists ignored it because they couldn't patent it. Fertilizer companies despised it because it made their products irrelevant. Big agriculture rejected it because it produced too much food for too little money. And yet, despite every attempt to bury this knowledge, a handful of families kept the method alive. They passed it down quietly, grandparent to parent, parent to child, almost like a secret recipe. Today, if you're lucky enough to meet one of these families, you'll notice something strange. Their gardens look wild, uncontrolled, random. But spend 5 minutes in them, and you'll see the genius plants arranged not by aesthetics but by cooperation. The mineral-rich beds that never compact. The roots that mine nutrients from deep underground. The vines that climb without supports. The constant hum of pollinators. It doesn't look manufactured. It looks alive. And here's the truth most modern gardeners refuse to accept. You can't buy this system in a store. You can't assemble it from bags, bottles, and weekend shopping trips. You build it piece by piece, and once it's running, it becomes the most powerful food machine you've ever seen. This is the banned blueprint, not illegal, but quietly erased, because if people relearned it, the billion-dollar gardening industry would lose everything.